Only 28 marbles? Zack smirked. Amateur. I managed to cram 32 of them inside a box like that. Zorian gave Zack a suspicious look, but it didn't seem like his fellow time traveler was lying about that. Damn it, Zorian grumbled. All those specialized shaping exercises and I still can't advance faster in this field than you do. I have 6 times more mana than you do and you're further hampered by the number of simulacrums you keep around you at all times, Zack said with a careless shrug. It's hard to make up for such a disadvantage. He was right, of course. Truthfully, it was amazing he was able to keep up with Zack's learning rate at all. It still made him feel a little annoyed that he lost their informal competition about who would advance faster in the field of pocket dimension creation. Oh well, there was still time to catch up. They would be chipping away at the topic for quite a few restarts after this, and he was confident he had more patience than Zack did. It ended up taking Silver Lake nearly 4 hours to finish the potion, despite her claim that it could be done in as little as 2 hours. She claimed she had merely been waiting for the concoction to cool down to a comfortable drinking temperature before bringing it over, but Zorian suspected it had more to do with the process being harder than she'd thought it would be rather than anything considerate like that. You should drink the potion soon, Silver Lake told him. The instructions were a little fuzzy about its shelf life and there was a bit of unplanned excitement involved in making it, so I had to add in a little something to forcibly stabilize it. It should retain its potency for about a week, after which there is a small but non-trivial chance it might explode in your face. Best not to take that chance, Unplanned excitement, you say, Zack deadpanned. That doesn't exactly inspire confidence. I'm 97.3% sure it will work as expected, Silver Lake said firmly. There was a small silence as Silver Lake looked at them expectantly, no doubt hoping one of them would ask her why it was 97.3 instead of 99 or something like that. She would be sorely disappointed. They both knew better than to humor her like that. I'm 97.3% sure you pulled that number out of your ass, Zorian told her bluntly. But it doesn't matter. This month is approaching its end and time will soon reset itself. I'm going to drink this right away. Ah yes, the great time reset, Silver Lake said. You're still going on about that, huh? Well, did I ever tell you about? But Zorian wasn't listening anymore. He uncapped the potion bottle Silver Lake handed to him and immediately drank the entire potion. The thick green liquid was bitter as hell but otherwise unremarkable. For a few seconds nothing happened, and then he experienced a sensation reminiscent of the soul-stealing move he had experienced when fighting the Soul-Sizer Chrysanthemum, and his senses rapidly began to dim. He lost consciousness. When Zorian woke up he found out 2 days had gone by. They had expected as much, though. According to what they knew, the process of gaining soul perception through this method always took at least a day and could take as many as 5. Some unfortunate souls, ignorant of this little detail, had been known to die of dehydration after drinking a potion like this in secret. In regards to what had happened while he was unconscious, Zorian had only the fuzziest of recollections. He had periodically regained awareness throughout the process, but it was like trying to remember a dream. He remembered a series of senseless, disjointed images. A sea of suns connected by glowing threads, a massive volcano in the middle of an eruption, a carpet of smoke crawling across desolate lands. Just like his usual dreams, in other words. He put it out of his mind and focused on the important stuff, like whether he had successfully acquired soul sight or not. The answer was that he had. It wasn't as instinctive as Zorian's mind magic, but Zorian had found a sufficient amount of instructions in Sudamir's mind to figure out what he had to do. So long as he poured mana into his soul in very specific ways, he could see the souls of other people. It wasn't really sight as such so much as a whole new sense that gave him headaches when he tried to process what it was really telling him, but that would improve with time and practice. Overall, Zorian considered the whole thing to be a massive success. The only problem with the whole thing was that he had forgotten to mention to Amaya and Kiriel that he would be absent from home for several days. So Zack had to take the brunt of their ire and convince them not to report his disappearance to the police. Now all 3 were kind of annoyed with him. Currently, Zorian was sort of hiding from them in Silver Lake's pocket dimension. Of course, he did have a valid reason for being there. Beside that, he was trying to find something that would convince her future self that the time loop is real. Silver Lake did have a penchant for telling him little personal stories from time to time, but it was hard to discern which ones were fake and which ones real, so he doubted that would help him convince her in the future. Did you know I was considered a dangerous radical in my youth? Silver Lake asked him. Zorian didn't and told her so. Oh yes. When I was born, the covens had already been on their last legs. Icosian magic had shown itself to be mostly superior to our own spellcasting traditions. After all, most of our spells are long rituals involving lots of chanting and standing still for hours on end, or relied upon invoking the spirits of the land, who are notoriously fickle things if you ask me. You can never rely on them to aid you when you need them the most. The one thing we had going for us, our potion making, the Icosians simply copied and then improved upon. I saw all this and I decided to commit a huge heresy. I decided to study Icosian methods in addition to the traditional education I received from my mother. My coven exiled me for it when they found out. Tragic, Zorian said. But that wasn't quite what I was looking for. I'm pretty sure you wouldn't really be surprised if I revealed I knew this little tidbit of your past. No, of course not, Silver Lake said. I'm sure you could find out that and more if you really decided to investigate my history. If you came to me and started narrating my past, I'd just think you did your homework before coming to see me. Right? Zorian nodded. So I'd really prefer if you gave me something more substantial. Surely you have some kind of private password that you could easily tell me without truly inconveniencing yourself. You can change it immediately after you tell me, so it's not like there is any danger I'll abuse it. Not during this month, no, Silver Lake scoffed. But what if you're right? I have no assurance you'll only use such a secret to convince my future self of your crazy tale. You could use it just as easily to rob her blind. But you don't believe in the time loop? Zorian tried. If I'm going to entertain a stupid hypothetical, I'm not going to do a half-assed job, Silver Lake said, her tone brooking no argument. But, I think I have it. Do you remember how you came in front of my home and made all that racket to draw my attention? Of course, Zorian nodded. It's one of the best moments of this month. Silver Lake took a sudden swipe at him with her bony, withered hand, but Zorian successfully dodged her strike. Brat. I should refuse to say anything now, but I don't want you pestering me about this further, Silver Lake grumbled. Anyway, at some point I actually considered the possibility of someone finding my abode and trying to catch my attention. I was thinking of what would be the proper, polite way of doing that, and I realized I would probably have to install some kind of doorbell or something. And that would be kind of incompatible with the whole hidden nature of this place, no? Right? Zorian agreed. So the doorbell would have to be hidden too, accessible only to people who have been told about it in advance. Exactly, Silver Lake said. Now, in the end, I just scrapped the whole idea. I didn't want people visiting the place too casually. However, I did implement part of the system before I gave up. There is a stone in this place that emits shrill whistles when a special keystone is activated right outside the entrance to this dimension. These keystones were never actually made, so the whistle stone just sits there uselessly gathering dust. I guess there is no harm in showing you how to create a matching keystone. And that would convince you there's something funny going on? Zorian asked. Well, yes, I guess it would, Silver Lake said. I mean, I never actually made a single keystone, let alone distributed them to people. How could you possibly create one that matches perfectly with the whistle stone in my dimension? If you showed up holding one of those, that would catch my attention for sure. Zorian grinned. He had a feeling their chances of convincing Silver Lake in the future had just dramatically improved. Break. One of the more unexpected things about this restart was that Daimon had made a surprise decision to stay in Cyoria for the last few days of the restart. Zorian was not sure what exactly triggered this decision. Perhaps it was because Zorian had asked to borrow his divine artifice mirror for a little research, or because his eldest brother had joined them in exploring the ruined palace inside the orb this time. But he suddenly decided he absolutely must see the invasion that occurs on the night of the summer festival. Zorian thought nothing of it at first. Even when Daimon came to Cyoria a few days before the actual day of the invasion, making a mysterious claim that he had something he needed to do, Zorian just dismissed it as him wanting to talk with his old friends or whatever. Then Daimon came to him for help, and Zorian realized he probably should have inquired deeper into what Daimon was doing while back home in Eldamar. No, Daimon, Zorian told him firmly. I am not going to set up a meeting between you and Fortov. Come on, Zorian, this is our family at stake here, Daimon pleaded. Oh please, Zorian protested. You and Fortov not getting along with each other is not a crisis. That's par for the course in our family. Stop being so melodramatic. Crisis or no, this time loop is perfect for solving things like this, and it will take so little effort too. Show some compassion for your big brother and do me a favor, eh? Daimen insisted. Haven't I let you borrow my mirror when you asked despite my better judgment? And let's not forget about that secret room full of treasure that I found in the ruined palace. It would have taken you months to find that without me if you ever did. Zorian made a sour face. Yes, Daimen was rather more helpful in this restart than he usually was. That secret room in particular. They were still sorting through the contents, but it would seem there were some very nice things hidden there. One of the daggers appeared to be a genuine divine artifact. They had no idea what it did yet, but even if it turned out to be underwhelming, it would be extremely valuable as a research subject and priceless trade good. Look, Zorian said. Using me as a lure so you can basically ambush Fortov out there in the open really doesn't sit well with me. Don't you think that's kind of a jerk thing to do? I thought you hated Fortov? Daimen challenged, raising his eyebrow at him. I don't like him, but this sort of manipulative maneuver doesn't sit well with me, Zorian said. Just go confront him directly, okay? I'm sure he'll relent if you keep pestering him. No, he won't, Daimen said slowly. Do you think I'd suggest this if that worked? Besides, you're looking at this the wrong way. You don't have to trick him or anything. You said he always seeks you out at the end of the restart so long as you don't avoid him. Something about the cure for the purple creeper rash, yes. Yes, Zorian reluctantly admitted. So you want me to just go somewhere where he can easily reach and wait for him to show up on his own? Yes, Daimen nodded. Since you haven't asked him to meet with you, he has no right to complain when it turns out I was in the vicinity. Well, all right, Zorian sighed. Though if you have been pestering him these past few days, he might decide to deviate from his usual pattern. It's amazing as it is that he always ends up pushing Ibri into that purple creeper patch. That has got to be a deliberate move on his part. Daimen agreed. I should ask about that too, I guess. The final plan was very simple. Zorian would spend the evening walking around the city, occasionally casting divinations to see if Fortov was approaching. If he was, he would quickly seek shelter in one of the many coffee shops scattered around Cyoria, under the theory that Fortov was slightly less likely to start yelling at Daimen in the middle of a crowded coffee shop than in the middle of the street or whatever. Once Fortov sat down, Daimen would show up to crash the event. Daimen's little plot worked perfectly. Fortov did show up, looking for Zorian's help in procuring an anti-rash potion. Zorian had already made the necessary salve before coming here, so he just handed the little jar full of salve to Fortov and sat back to finish the cup of tea he ordered. Fortov looked down at the cure jar in his hand, fingering it awkwardly, and frowned at him. You just happen to have that very specific cure lying around in your pocket? Fortov asked Zorian incredulously. What the hell, Zorian? Do you carry a whole apothecary with you at all times or something? Well, the way his pocket dimension creation skills were advancing, that might actually be a possibility in the future. I knew you'd be looking for that, Zorian said. I spoke to Ibri after all. Fortov's face twisted in surprise. She spoke to you? He asked, shocked. Oh man, why me? Look, thank you for this, but... You pushed her into that purple creeper patch deliberately, didn't you? Zorian said, not really asking so much as making an observation. It's not that simple, okay? Fortov said defensively. You don't know what she's like. I know she looks quiet and all, but she was being really aggressive and wouldn't take no for an answer, and she kept trying to kiss me, and I guess I went a little overboard. And a purple creeper patch just happened to be nearby? Zorian asked. Fortov's explanation was great and all, but how did that explain Ibri ending up in that bush every single time? I deliberately took the purple creeper-related task when they were distributing class assignments because people usually avoid them like a plague. But that didn't deter her this time. I guess in retrospect it would have been smarter to take something where lots of other people would be nearby. At least that would stop her from trying to get physical with me. Zorian was going to inquire more about this, but this was the moment that Daimen finally showed up to crash the meeting. Strange. He actually kind of wished Daimen had taken longer to arrive. The story was just getting interesting. You again. Fortov hissed, giving Daimen an angry glare. Why can't you take the hint? And how the hell are you even here? I thought you were supposed to be in Koth. Please, I just wanted to talk, okay? Why are you being so? Zorian leaned back in his chair, taking another sip of his tea, and mentally toned down the volume of the shouting going around him. So much for the idea that Fortov would hold back because they were in a public location. But it didn't matter because this was Damon's stage now and there was no need for him to get involved. Well, there wasn't any need for it until both of them decided to pull him into their argument just because he was there. And because his smug attitude pissed them off, apparently. Sometimes he just couldn't win. Chapter 076. Critical Blunder. The evening was a pleasant one, with cool winds blowing through the streets of Cyoria and the moon shining brightly in the sky. Zorian took it all in, feeling somewhat invigorated by the evening chill, and thought about life. It was interesting, Zorian mused, that even after all these years spent in the time loop, some simple experiences had eluded him until now. Getting thrown out of a coffee shop for disturbing the other customers, for instance, was an entirely novel experience. He glanced to the side where Daimen and Fortov were currently having a tense face-off, staring at each other with serious expressions. He wasn't even angry, in all honesty. Yes, being ejected out of the building was mildly embarrassing, but it didn't bother him all that much. What did bother him was that even after causing such a commotion, they still failed to even establish what the problem was. Honestly, these two. Look, Zorian began cautiously, I understand you being mad at Daimen, but you're only shooting yourself in the foot here. The reason Daimen sought you out is because he wants to know why you're angry with him. If you want to get rid of him, just tell him what your problem with him is and he'll go away. Well, probably. Don't you start, Fortov said, giving him a suspicious frown. You helped him set this up, didn't you? I didn't ask you to seek me out, Zorian pointed out calmly. You decided that on your own. And nobody forced you to stay around and argue with Daimen either. You already have the salve you came for, no? You could have just picked yourself up and left the moment Daimen showed up. That's what I'd have done in your place. The fact that you stayed around means you do want Daimen to know why you're angry after all. For a second, Fortov just stared at him, a stony expression on his face. It was a somewhat alien look on the normally amiable Fortov. I so want to punch you in the face right now, you smug asshole, Fortov eventually said. But I suppose there is something to that logic, so I'll restrain myself. Finally, Daimen mumbled, just loud enough for both of them to hear him. All this dancing around and refusing to say what's bothering you, I almost thought you had turned into a woman while I wasn't looking. Fortov glared furiously at him, to which Daimen reacted only by rolling his eyes. Thankfully, the shouting didn't start up again. It seemed that Fortov had gotten his anger out of his system a bit. Right now, just before the nice waitress asked us to leave the premises, I believe you were saying something about your problems with the academy being Daimen's fault? Zorian prompted. It was in his best interest to help Daimen get his answer now, or else the man would no doubt make more annoying plots like this one in upcoming restarts. Which is ridiculous, Daimen butted in. We barely even interacted with each other by the time Fortov started attending the academy in Cyoria. Yes, Fortov said, pointing his index finger at Daimen with a stabbing motion. Then he repeated the gesture for emphasis. Yes, that's exactly my problem. We barely interacted at all. What? Daimen asked uncomprehendingly. You don't even know what I'm talking about, Fortov said, more as a statement of fact than a question. I think that's what pisses me off the most about this. You don't even remember. You've completely forgotten all about your promise. Well, what promise? Daimen fumbled. You were supposed to help me. Fortov burst out, pointing at Daimen again and then hitting himself in the chest with a closed fist to indicate himself. Remember? I came to you before enrolling here and asked you if I could count on you to support me when I run into troubles at the academy, and you said yes. You said I could always come to you for help if I needed it and that it's no issue at all. Daimen visibly winced at those words. Oh, he said weakly. That. Yes, that, Fortov said sullenly. I was such a fool to actually trust you on that. What good is a promise like that when you're always busy with something, always unreachable and brushing me off when you're not? You probably forgot about that promise the moment you made it, if you ever took it seriously at all. I made that promise in good faith, Daimen protested. It's just that I had some professional opportunities come up afterwards that were too good to let go. Don't you think it's kind of unreasonable of you to expect me to sabotage my career just to help you with schoolwork? I mean, you could have always just asked Zorian for help instead, and both Fortov and Zorian gave him a glare for that. Daimen considered his words for a moment and then mumbled something that was either a quick prayer to the gods or a colorful curse before dropping the idea and moving on. Anyway, moving on, Daimen said, coughing into his fist. I guess I kind of did fail you there. I do admit that. However, to say that makes me responsible for your academy problems, that's still rubbish. Let's be honest here, for me helping you out every once in a while wouldn't have made much of a difference in the grand scheme of things. It wasn't supposed to be every once in a while, you jerk, Fortov protested. Zorian stood off to the side, shaking his head as the two continued to argue. As minutes ticked by, it became obvious that this promise thing meant completely different things to Fortov than it did to Daimen. Fortov, it turned out, had understood Daimen's promise as a commitment to a much heavier form of support. Though Fortov did not phrase things that way, Zorian understood his middle brother's explanations for what they were. An admission that he expected to be carried along throughout his entire education on Daimen's coattails. Daimen, on the other hand, probably made that promise without much thought put into it, thinking it a mere formality. He evidently expected that Fortov would come seek him out once every few months to ask a question or two and talk about girls and life and stuff. Amusingly enough, he ended up not even getting that in the end. Can't you see you're being completely unreasonable? Daimen said, gesticulating wildly. Do you even hear what you're saying? You basically expected me to do half of your work for you. That's completely ridiculous. He's right, it is, added Zorian, nodding sagely. I was just describing an ideal case. I would have been happy with even a fraction of it, Fortov shot back. And it doesn't matter because in the end I got nothing at all. You gave me a promise and then you forgot you'd ever made it. That's a jerk thing to do no matter how you try to spin it. He's right, it is, added Zorian, nodding sagely. Shut up, Zorian, they both said in perfect synchronization. Zorian pretended to stagger back from the outburst and mimicked clamping his mouth shut. As for Daimen and Fortov, the two of them shared an uncertain look between each other before quietly deciding to calm down a little and take a step back. Zorian would have liked to claim that this was his plan all along, but truthfully he was just messing with them for his own amusement. But seriously, you're being kind of crazy here, Daimen said to Fortov again, a little more sedately this time. I get that you're having problems with your studies, but... Man, you just don't understand, Fortov complained, cutting him off. This city, this academy, it's out of my league. I know this. I've always known this. I know my limits. I'm not as smart as you and Zorian. You're plenty smart, Fortov, Zorian cut in. You're just lazy. Fortov didn't even try to refute him, but Daimen gave him a sidelong glance. I thought you were going to keep quiet? Daimen asked. I lied, Zorian said with a careless shrug. Whatever, Fortov said, exhaling heavily. I'm not as good as you two. Happy now? Zorian made a circular motion with his hand, signaling him to keep going. Anyway, my point was that I only agreed to enroll here because Daimen said he would support me. If I had known I would have to do this alone, I would have told mother and father to enroll me somewhere else. Somewhere less prestigious. But they pushed hard for this, saying what an opportunity this is, and I thought, well, at least I'll have my genius older brother there to help me sort things out. Zorian didn't say anything after that, quietly waiting by the side and letting the two of them talk. He didn't feel much compassion for Fortov's plight. Daimen may have a cause for feeling a little guilty about how things turned out, but all Zorian saw was the same old Fortov he'd known from his childhood. A lazy, shallow asshole constantly looking for ways to shift his own responsibilities onto people around him. He was darkly amused when the two of them eventually decided to just take a step back and have another meeting in a week or so. Something that would never happen, and Daimen damn well knew so. Oh well, it wasn't really Zorian's problem. That is, until Fortov left the scene and Daimen tried to make it his problem. No, Daimen, I am not going to delve into the hows and whys of Fortov's failures and assemble a tutoring program for him, Zorian bluntly told him. Why not? You do for Kiriel and even that female friend of yours, Dun said. He's your brother, Zorian. Sorry, but you can't guilt-trip me into doing this. Mother's antics have made me completely immune to guilt trips, Zorian said dispassionately. I am sick and tired of having to pick up after Fortov's failures time and time again. How about you do it for once in your life? You're the one who made a promise that you failed to keep, no? Don't you think it's in poor taste to try fobbing this off on me so quickly after your little heart-to-heart with Fortov? The restart is just about to end. When else am I going to talk to you about this if not now? Daimen protested. And I don't retain memories over the restarts like you do, that's why I can't do it. But you can leave yourself notes at the end of each restart and work on the problem that way, Zorian countered. You are doing that very thing in order to figure out how to get mother and father to accept your marriage to Orissa, so I don't see why you can't apply it here too. Diamond frowned, either because he did not like the idea or because he was reminded of how utterly he had failed in his task of convincing them thus far. He's your brother, Diamond, Sorian said, flinging his words back at him. Ugh, Diamond grumbled. You can be such a little shit sometimes. Fine, you win. I guess it has to be me. But I'll need you to do me a small favor. One restart ended and a new one began. At the start of the new restart, Zack and Zorian immediately invaded Jornak's home, knocking him out, kidnapping him and searching his home. They found Veyers dead in the guest room, just like Jornak's story in the previous restart suggested they would. Using his brand new soul perception and a couple of soul magic forensic spells he had stolen from Sudamir's mind. Unsurprisingly, necromancers had a very developed tradition of analytic spells meant to be used on corpses. Zorian determined that Veyers was in a virtually identical situation as the soul killed Arania beneath Cyoria. Normally, when one's soul was ripped out of their body, there would be subtle signs left etched into the flesh of the deceased, and these could be used to infer the method of extraction used. Neither the Arania nor Veyers showed such traces, though it was as if they were merely flesh puppets that had never held any life to begin with. They had expected such a result, but it was nice to have things confirmed so clearly. After examining Veyers' body, they moved on to Jornak. Zorian had expected the young lawyer to be absolutely livid at them, but the way they just barged into his home and brutally subdued him must have clued him in to the fact they weren't here on behalf of regular law enforcement. Or maybe it was their age. Zorian sometimes forgot to account for that little detail as he felt pretty old these days, but he and Zack still looked like teenagers. Jornak was thus a lot more subdued this time around, too terrified about what they wanted to do with him to put up much of a resistance. Sadly, interrogating him with the aid of truth potions and mind magic yielded very little of note. Everything was mostly as Jornak had said in the previous restart, except that Veyers was also something of an informant for the young lawyer in addition to being a friend. He basically reported anything interesting that occurred in his house to Jornak, who then forwarded the information to the cult of the World Dragon. Thus, Veyers was something of an unwitting low-level spy for the cult. Finally, Zack and Zorian sat down one day to discuss their findings and what they meant regarding the identity of Red Robe. So, Zack began, we've confirmed that Veyers is either Red Robe or connected to him in some fashion. His body is clearly just a meat puppet that never held a soul to begin with, just like the bodies of your Iranian friends beneath the city. Either he was somehow connected to Red Robe and the man decided to use soul kill on him, or he is Red Robe and this is what happens to a controller's body when they leave the time loop. Is that about right? It is, Zorian confirmed. Additionally, the fact Red Robe saw fit to delete your memories of Veyers reinforces his importance. We haven't been able to find anyone else whose entire presence had been scoured from your mind, so whatever link he has to Red Robe isn't small. He also has a reason to be bitter at the city and a link to the invasion, however tenuous, Zack added. Yeah, he could totally be Red Robe. Even his height and build matches what I remember of him when he attacked me at the start of that one restart. Sadly, that is not real proof of anything, Zorian said, shaking his head. At the level of skill we are working at, that sort of thing is trivially easy to fake. All it takes is a quick transformation spell and you could radically change your height and build. Well, he did attack me at the very start of the restart when he was undoubtedly in a hurry and didn't have much time to make detailed preparations. Maybe it slipped his mind? You have a better memory than I do and you saw him up close. How does the Red Robe in your mind compare to Veyers? Zorian considered it carefully. After a while he decided that Zack was right. Veyers did have the appropriate height and build to be the Red Robe in his memories. It is as you say, Zorian said slowly. He does kind of fit under that robe. But really, in order to get to the bottom of this, we need to find out what happens when a controller leaves the time loop. This should tell us whether Veyers is just a soul-killed victim or the very mastermind we are looking for. And how are we supposed to do that? Zack complained. That stupid guardian of the threshold thing refuses to entertain hypotheticals like that. We already asked it what happens in this scenario, remember? It simply insisted that no such thing could transpire. Besides, we still don't know what method Red Robe used to leave. If he's a later addition to the time loop like you assume he is, he couldn't have used the normal method to do so. He would have run into the problem of his original already having a soul, which should have led to the Guardian refusing to cooperate. Depending on what method Red Robe used to leave the time loop, the answer to the question of what would happen to his body might radically change. Not necessarily, Sorian said. One thing that always stuck with me about Red Robe is that he honestly seemed concerned about the possibility of there being a large number of other time travelers involved in the time loop. That means that he knew of a very easy and reliable way of inducing people in the time loop and thought it was entirely plausible that someone was using it on a mass scale. He did seem quite certain that there were a lot of other time travelers lurking around, Zack said, frowning. My memory of that time is not the best, but that did appear to be the main thing he sought answers about when he probed my mind that night. Right, Sorian said. And this method couldn't have been the same as what I went through because what happened to me is highly dangerous to the marker donor and probably doesn't give consistent results. It also couldn't have been something that is hard to set up, or else Red Robe wouldn't have accepted it happening so readily and on such a large scale. So what is it then? Zack asked impatiently. I'm guessing you have some sort of answer or else you wouldn't be mentioning it. Don't try to reenact those cheap detective novels with me, please. I always found the long reveals in those books to be really annoying. Fine, I'll be blunt, Sorian sighed. Killjoy. I think Red Robe was simply using a modified temporary marker to persist in the time loop. Sure, they're supposed to last only 6 months, but that's probably just an extra restriction rather than something inherent in the marker itself. And my own marker demonstrates quite clearly that these markers can be damaged. Perhaps selectively damaged, allowing people to remove some of the functions. There have to be some protections against that, Zack frowned. I doubt that the makers of the system would just allow people to tinker with their work like that. Possibly, Sorian conceded. Not having seen any temporary marker yet, I can offer little except baseless speculation. But still, this seems to me like the most likely and straightforward way for Red Robe to enter the time loop. Zack considered his words for a while before giving it a careless shrug and focusing his attention back to Sorian. All right, Zack shrugged. Let's assume you're right. So what? How does that relate to what we were talking about? Well, the temporary markers are supposed to be temporary, Sorian said. There is probably a clear course of action meant to be done when they run out and the person they were supporting disappears. And this course of action will probably be performed even if the person disappears prematurely through some other method. Oh, Zack said, slapping himself in the forehead. Of course. So if Red Robe entered the time loop through a selectively damaged temporary marker, all we have to do to find out what would happen after he leaves is place a temporary marker on someone and see what happens after it runs out. Exactly, Sorian nodded. A brief silence descended on the scene. You know, Zack began after a while, I'm pretty sure we already know the answer to that question. Probably just recreates a person from its usual template, as if they were never a temporary looper to begin with. I have no proof of this, but it intuitively makes sense to me. You are probably correct, Sorian nodded. I also have no proof, but it is consistent with the intent of the time loop as the training simulation to set things up in that fashion. Which would mean that Vaers isn't Red Robe, Zack continued with that line of thought. Red Robe should have ended up as a normal person with no memory of his time-looping self, not a soulless corpse. If he really did enter the time loop via a modified temporary marker, that is probably the case, Sorian nodded. Zack hummed thoughtfully, tapping his fingers against his chin. So let's assume for a moment that Vaers is just a broken link. I still think he's the most likely candidate for Red Robe, but whatever, your theory does sound rather plausible. Who is Vaers linked to? Jornak? Is he Red Robe? He could be, I guess, Sorian said uncertainly. I mean, I see no real evidence for that, and the man is not very impressive. We weren't very impressive before the time loop happened to us either, Zack pointed out. True, Sorian said. I'm not saying it's impossible for Jornak to be Red Robe, just that I see no real evidence for the idea. Did Vaers have any other friends and associates other than Jornak? Zack asked. I think he did, but Jornak did not know who these people were, Sorian said. Vaers didn't like to talk about his personal life and Jornak didn't pry into it too much. The fact that Vaers chose to take shelter in Jornak's place might be artificially skewing our perception of how close they were. They weren't really that close. Jornak was actually quite surprised when Vaers came knocking on his door with a plea to let him stay for a while, and even contemplated refusing. They discussed things for another hour or so before deciding to shelve the discussion for now. They would be interrogating Jornak in more detail in upcoming days, which would hopefully shed more light on the issue. They also intended to use pieces of Veyer's body as divination tools to try and track his movement while he was alive. They would have to do this very, very carefully though, lest they get tracked down themselves by the Boronova House investigators. Eventually the two of them retired into one of the quieter, less frequented taverns on the outskirts of the city and sat down to have a drink and talk about less serious topics. The waitress gave Zorian a really weird look when he ordered fruit juice instead of anything alcoholic, and Zack mocked him for it, but Zorian wasn't really bothered about that. Instead he decided to make use of this opportunity to complain about the family drama that Daimen forced him to participate in near the end of the previous restart. "Oh man, your family is such a train wreck," Zack laughed. "It's not even funny, except it kind of is. Though I have to admit, I kinda get the urge to defend Fortov when you explain his situation like that. I mean, I understand why you feel the way you do, but us fuck-ups needs to look out for each other, you know? What do you— Oh yeah, you were kind of doing badly in the academy yourself, weren't you?" Zorian suddenly realized. He winced. "Sorry. I wasn't thinking." "No, it's fine," Zack said, shaking his head. "I'm not insulted. Much like Fortov, I too had excuses for my poor performance. But I understand now that they were just that, excuses. Perhaps Fortov will eventually learn his lesson as well." Perhaps," Zorian agreed diplomatically. Zack responded by taking a deep sip out of his beer keg and then leaned back in his chair in contentment. "You know, every time I think about what my future would have been like if I never got pulled into this time loop thing, I get both furious and horrified," Zack said, staring at the ceiling of the tavern with unfocused eyes. "It's been so long, but I remember what it was like so very vividly. How I lived in an empty, half-abandoned house, constantly hearing about how I was expected to rebuild my entire house from scratch and feeling utterly lost as to how I can accomplish it. How I eventually decided it was a hopeless task and began to coast by on the least amount of effort I could get away with and just tried to keep myself happy. But hey, it was fine. I had plenty of money. I mean, that was why Tezen fired all the servants and sold off all our properties, right? So it doesn't matter if I don't do too well at the academy and have no real professional skills. Everything will work out, just fine." Zack suddenly finished off his beer keg and then slammed it violently onto the cheap wooden table. The tavern workers all turned towards them, and for a moment Zorian thought he would be thrown out of a building for the second time in 2 restarts. But in the end they just shook their heads slightly and went about their work. Evidently this was not a rare occurrence around here. "I'm getting angry again," Zack explained unnecessarily. "I shouldn't be talking about this while drinking." Zorian scratched his cheek awkwardly, not sure how to respond to that. He was really regretting starting the topic about Fortov now. "You know what the problem with teaming up with you is?" Zack asked him suddenly, staring intently into his eyes. He didn't wait for his answer. "I can't start a restart by beating Tezen into a bloody pulp anymore. I used to do that every once in a while to work out my frustrations." Zorian remembered that. It used to occur quite frequently, leading up to a lot of speculation about Zack and his reasons for doing that. "It's probably for the best you stop doing that," Zorian told him. "You might develop unhealthy habits and end up becoming a fugitive for no good reason once we're out of the time loop. That would be a pretty sad way for all this to end, no?" "I guess," Zack said. "But it was so satisfying." Zack eyed his keg for a couple of seconds as if considering if he should get himself another before sighing and pushing it to the side. "Good. He'd rather not deal with a drunk Zack right now. What do you intend to do about Tezen anyway?" Zorian asked. "When we get out of the time loop, I mean." "What else?" "I'm going to sue him into oblivion," Zack said. "He may be powerful and well-connected, but I still have some friends in high places and he was pretty brazen in his actions. He broke the law when he robbed me of my inheritance and I'll do my best to make him pay for it through official channels. If that doesn't work, well, I hope it doesn't get to that." "I see," Zorian said. "I didn't see you do any research on the topic thus far." "I've already done all the preparations a long time ago," Zack said. "I have all the evidence I need, I know how to blindside him when putting things into motion, and I can afford to hire the best damn lawyers in the country to represent me. There is nothing more that can be done within the confines of the restart. These kind of legal cases take years of legal wrangling, not weeks. Still, a strong start does count for a lot, and all the lawyers I spoke with tell me I have a good chance of winning." "That's good," Zorian nodded slowly. Though I have a suspicion Tezen and his faction won't limit themselves to mere legal wrangling in their attempts to deal with you. I know, Zack grinned. But you know me. I don't shy away from danger. Let them come. It will just give me a stronger case when it turns up what they've been up to. Anything I can do to help? Zorian asked. Probably not actually, Zack said, shaking his head. This is mostly a job for lawyers, not for the likes of us. Once I put things into motion, I just need to keep the money flowing and ward off any assassination attempts and the like. But we'll see. Rest assured I will not be too shy to ask for help from my fellow time traveler. The conversation wound down after that, and they each went their separate ways for the day. The upcoming days were going to be somewhat busy ones, involving a great deal of preparations and planning. It was time to visit Silver Lake again, and this time they planned to seriously try and convince her that the time loop is real. Break. When Zack and Zorian showed at Silver Lake's hidden base, they came carrying the Grey Hunter's egg sac and the ancient giant salamander that Silver Lake was looking for. The eggs were acquired in the exact same way they had been in the previous restart. As for the salamander, they just went to the same place Zorian had found it in the past and then started their search from there. Eventually, after 2 whole days of searching up and down the river and examining nearby hiding places, they found the giant salamander buried in the mud of one of the flooded caverns, almost undetectable if one didn't know what to look for. Without an appropriate starting point, it would have taken them forever to track it down. But no matter, the point was that they had both of the ingredients that Silver Lake wanted so badly for her youth potion, and Zorian had created the keystone that Silver Lake had shown him how to make in the previous restart. They also loaded up a bunch of combat golems into the portable palace orb, ready to be taken out at a moment's notice, just in case Silver Lake reacted badly to their approach, something that was entirely possible but unavoidable. They didn't have the time to take things slowly anymore. I'm ready, Zack said, twirling a combat staff in his fingers to pass the time. Go ahead and ring the bell. Zorian nodded and activated the keystone in his hands. Nothing visible happened, but Zorian was sure he had performed the action correctly. Now they could only wait. They had to wait a surprisingly long time, longer than they had to the last time they had come here. Zorian suspected this was because Silver Lake was studying them from inside before deciding to come out, and this time they had come more heavily armed and visibly dangerous. Eventually, however, she decided to greet them anyway. The fact that Zack had gotten bored at some point and started building a giant statue of himself via alteration spells right outside her home might have motivated her to hurry up. How the hell did you activate that old piece of junk? She immediately demanded, squinting at each of them suspiciously. I never gave anyone a matching keystone. Hell, I never even made any matching keystones. Suspicious. Very, very suspicious. Who are you two? To answer your last question, I am Zack Novita and this is Zorian Kaczynski. We are but humble academy students coming here to pay our respects to a living legend, Zack flattered shamelessly. Silver Lake snorted derisively at him, saying nothing. And also to arrange for a trade, I guess. Or should I say, renegotiate our existing one? After all, this is the second time we're meeting like this. I don't think so, Silver Lake said curiously. I don't remember you. I may be old, but I'm pretty sure I'd never forget a couple of brats as brazen as you two. I mean, I kind of like that kind of attitude, but only when it's directed at other people. That's just because your memory of our meeting has been wiped clean from your mind, Zorian said in a carefree manner. Nothing to worry about. Anyway, here is a gift. Zorian reached into his backpack and withdrew a bottle of brandy and a box of sweets from it, which he then handed to a surprised Silver Lake. She made no move to claim them, looking at both objects like they were poisonous vipers. A gift? She asked emotionlessly. It is customary to bring gifts when visiting someone, Zorian said sagely. It's an important tradition. Silver Lake made a sour face at that explanation. She spent a few more seconds scrutinizing the two objects before finally deciding they were probably harmless. She took them both from his hands and immediately stuffed them into one of her jacket pockets. Even though the heavy bottle and the large box of sweets shouldn't have possibly been able to fit into that tiny jacket pocket, they somehow did. What a casual use of pocket dimension creation. Zorian couldn't help but feel a little jealous. He wouldn't be able to duplicate that feat and in fact didn't even know how to go about achieving it. He could only extend the space of rigid containers right now, and had no idea how to use something as flexible as a pocket as a base for a pocket dimension. He knew it was unreasonable to expect to be as good as Silver Lake after only a month of instruction, but this was a pretty stark reminder of how far he had to go to match the old witch's expertise in that regard. Silver Lake grinned at him in triumph, savoring this little victory for all it was worth. "Let's back up a bit, shall we?" she asked, a little more confident this time. "You said something about my memory being wiped?" "Yes," Zack nodded. "You see, about a month ago we came to you with a certain offer." And Zack started giving Silver Lake the summarized version of what happened in the previous restart, though they took pains to temporarily omit any mention of the time loop itself. They figured it would immediately make Silver Lake disbelieve anything else they had to say if they started with that. Instead, they just narrated the general terms of their deal and the way she had instructed them in the art of pocket dimension creation and occasionally sent them on random errands. And they used plenty of props in their explanation. When they spoke of how they offered the previous version of Silver Lake Grey Hunter's eggs, they took the eggs they obtained in this restart out of the portable palace orb and showed them to her. When they spoke of how Silver Lake told them she also needed an ancient giant salamander to complete her youth potion, they took out the living salamander they captured and showed it off as well. Silver Lake's eyes shone brightly when she saw the two alchemical ingredients she wanted the most laid out in front of her, but she remained silent and motionless as she listened to their story in a rapt manner. When it came time to move the story into Silver Lake's home dimension, though, her expression fell and turned grave. This was because Zorian started using illusionary scenes from his memory to illustrate his points. Normally, these kinds of illusory images weren't worth much as a proof. After all, nothing stopped the illusionist from fabricating things, and people's memories tended to be kind of fuzzy in even the best of cases. However, Zorian had the ability to remember a scene down to the tiniest detail, and it wasn't like one could randomly invent a detailed layout of Silver Lake's dimension and be correct. He could replicate the image of her favorite cauldron down to the tiniest scratch and replicate the exact number of dried onions and mushrooms hanging from the hooks on her wall. It was a pretty damning proof that he had at least been there at some point, even if he wasn't telling the truth about anything else, and Silver Lake clearly knew it. "Stop, stop," she suddenly told him, waving her hand in a forceful manner. She looked honestly shaken at the sight of these images. I need to check something." Zack and Zorian stood by the side while Silver Lake started casting one diagnostic spell after another on herself. Occasionally she would stop and mutter to herself in some alien Kusky tongue that neither Zack nor Zorian had ever encountered, before shaking her head and continuing with her self-diagnostics. After that, she started examining the entrance to her dimension before wordlessly disappearing inside. Zack and Zorian still waited patiently, not saying anything. She returned 20 minutes later, looking more disturbed than ever. "It doesn't make sense," she loudly proclaimed. "None of this makes sense. My memory is fine. It hasn't been tampered with. I know it hasn't because there are always traces left when one does so, and my mind doesn't have any. But you've clearly been inside my home long enough to dig up that old stone and puzzle out a matching keystone for it, long enough to memorize every corner of it down to the smallest detail. Except there is no trace of illegal entry, not even the faintest whiff of it, and there is no way in all the hells and all the heavens I'd ever forget letting someone like you inside. And your story. What a bunch of rubbish. You say you sold me Grey Hunter's eggs a whole month ago, yet I see no evidence I've ever processed them. And now you come here with a new sack of Grey Hunter's eggs, as if those can be acquired just by going into your neighborhood store or something. Who are you people and what is happening here?" She punctuated her statement by making a sweeping hand gesture, causing two huge hulking humanoids of Earth to suddenly coalesce out of the soil around them. Earth elementals, and not minor ones either. "Hover. Should we?" Zack mouthed. Zorian quietly nodded and made a sweeping gesture of his own, though his one was mostly for show, not because he actually needed to make it. Then again, maybe it was the same for Silver Lake. In any case, he made use of the time needed to make the gesture to reach out into the ever-useful orb, causing a bunch of equally huge and hulking war golems to pop into existence next to them. "We don't want to fight," Zorian said. "But if you really insist on it, I guarantee you it won't end in your favor." Rather than answer him, Silver Lake stomped her foot on the ground, causing a set of heavy, potent wards to radiate out of the entrance to her pocket dimensions. The warding scheme quickly enclosed the entire area, shutting down their teleportation, filling the area with fog, inhibiting their shaping skills, disturbing their souls. Even as Silver Lake was making her move, though, Zorian was doing the same. He quickly reached into his backpack again and retrieved from it a truncated pyramid made out of glittering blue stone. He threw it in front of him, and it promptly righted itself in the air and began to hover there, golden lines and glyphs suddenly appearing on its surface. In a blink of an eye, it had enclosed Zack, Zorian and their war golems under a dome of yellow light. Silver Lake's wards crashed into the dome, and were immediately halted in their tracks. The old witch was way better than Zorian in a number of fields, but her skill at setting up wards wasn't one of them. Not to mention that wards were always more effective as a means of defense than they were as an offensive tool. There was a tense silence as the two sides stared at each other from behind their respective barriers. After about a minute of this, Silver Lake suddenly sighed and commanded the earth elementals to merge back into the earth and the wards to retreat back into her pocket dimension. After a second of hesitation, Zack and Zorian similarly put away their own defenses. "Well," Silver Lake said, sounding surprisingly chirpy and relaxed. She chuckled at their wary postures and serious faces. "I really suffered a loss this time, didn't I? I guess this is what I get for trying to escalate things into combat. I was never that much of a fighter, truth be told. I don't suppose we could all forget this ever happened, Sure, let's," Zack said, giving her a friendly grin. "It's probably for the best if this never happens again, though. I only ever give people 2 chances. "Oh," Silver Lake said, cocking her head sideways like a curious bird. "Oh, I see. Everything I've been met with thus far is your friend's work, but he isn't actually the combat specialist. You are. And you never even made a move thus far." She shook her head, speaking to herself self-depreciatingly. "Silly old girl, making such blunders at your age. It's just as they say, you learn all your life and still die a fool. Though there should hopefully be no dying for me just yet. In any case," said Zorian, coughing into his fist to attract her attention, "I believe I have an answer for the concerns you expressed just before this unpleasantness. You were wondering how this was all possible, yes?" "Yes," she bluntly confirmed. "I'm very curious as to how this could happen." "It's like this," said Zorian, creating another illusory scene, this one depicting the planet they lived on, spinning placidly in the air. "There is an artifact from the Age of Gods that can take our entire world, take a snapshot of every single thing in existence and create a flawless copy of it in a giant pocket dimension." Surprisingly, after Zorian had gotten about halfway into the story, Silver Lake suddenly started to ask a series of rapid-fire questions about the Sovereign Gate, the Guardian of the Threshold, the exact mechanics of the time loop itself, and so on. "All right, you can stop now," she eventually said, tapping her leg with her bony fingers. "I think I know what's going on now. Well, somewhat. And if I'm right, then there is a very easy way to check if you're telling the truth or not." Zack and Zorian perked up at her words. "Oh," Zack asked excitedly,